Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're covering one of the strangest, most isolated, most quietly unhinged landmasses on the entire planet. Picture a place so far removed from everywhere else that when it finally acquired a mammal, the mammal in question was a bat. And even then the locals treated it like a novelty. A place that spent roughly 80 million years alone in the ocean with nothing but birds and insects for company, and came out the other side with a flightless parrot, a bug that can outweigh a sparrow, and a bird that laid an egg so large we're going to need a full paragraph just to explain it later. That place is New Zealand, and honestly, the strangest part of tonight's story might not even be the animals, it might be the ground underneath them. Most of this country's actual landmass, something like 94% of it, is currently sitting quietly at the bottom of the ocean. New Zealand, as it turns out, is just the roof of something much bigger. This is chapter 1 of a 6-part journey through New Zealand's full story, and tonight we're staying with the land, the rock, the fire underneath it, and the biology that grew out of being cut off from the world longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights, and let this one carry you off somewhere between a mountain range that's still rising and a very confused, very ancient parrot. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from tonight, half asleep or otherwise. Now, let's talk about the country that used to be a continent, and technically, depending on who you ask, still is one. Chapter 1. The continent nobody noticed was missing. Let's start with the thing that sounds made up, but isn't. For most of human history, everyone assumed New Zealand was just an island nation, a couple of decent-sized landmasses floating alone in the South Pacific, with nothing much going on underneath them. Turns out that was a bit like assuming an iceberg is just the small white triangle poking out of the water. In 2017, a team of geologists checked the crust beneath New Zealand against the actual scientific criteria for what makes a continent, and came back with an answer nobody expected. New Zealand isn't just a country. It's the visible tip of an entire 8th continent, and the continent has a name. They called it Zealandia. Here's where it gets properly absurd. Zealandia is enormous, roughly 4.9 million square kilometres of continental crust, about half the size of Australia. Of that entire continent, the part you could stand on without a submarine comes out to about 6%. The other 94% is down there in the dark, quietly being a continent nobody can see. Imagine finding out that 94% of your house was still there, just buried under the backyard, and you'd been living in the attic without realizing it. That's roughly the scale of surprise we're dealing with here. So how does a continent just sink? Around 85 million years ago, Zealandia was still attached to the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana, alongside what would eventually become Australia and Antarctica, and it was almost entirely dry land. Then it started pulling away, stretching and thinning as it rifted off on its own, and thin continental crust does not float particularly well. As Zealandia drifted into isolation, most of it slowly settled beneath the waves like a raft that had been quietly deflating the whole time, sinking for tens of millions of years. New Zealand's 2 main islands are the mountainous high points that never fully went under, held up by the tectonic forces we'll get to shortly. And here's the detail that genuinely surprised the scientists involved. A 2017 drilling expedition pulled core samples from deep beneath the Zealandia seafloor, and buried in those cores they found fossilized pollen and shell fragments from shallow, warm water, evidence that parts of this supposedly permanently drowned continent had at various points actually sat right at the surface before sinking again. Zealandia has spent millions of years bobbing near the waterline like a continent that genuinely could not commit to a decision. Now, the reason New Zealand itself stayed above water while the rest of Zealandia gave up and sank comes down to real estate. New Zealand sits directly on top of one of the most violent tectonic boundaries on the planet. You've probably heard of the Pacific Ring of Fire, that horseshoe-shaped belt circling the Pacific Ocean, stretching about 40,000 kilometers and containing something like 450 active volcanoes, responsible for roughly 75% of the world's eruptions and around 80% of its earthquakes. New Zealand isn't near the Ring of Fire. New Zealand is on it, sitting squarely across the collision zone between the Pacific Plate and the Australian Plate, which is a bit like building your house directly on top of two tectonic plates arm wrestling. And this collision doesn't even work the same way across the country. Off the east coast of the North Island, the Pacific Plate dives underneath the Australian Plate in a subduction zone, feeding the volcanoes running through the central North Island, places like Ruapehu, Tongariro, and Ngauruho, which movie fans will recognise as the real-life stand-in for Mount Doom. Yes, that Mount Doom. An actual functioning volcano with a habit of erupting was cast as the fictional home of the most evil piece of jewellery in cinema history, and frankly, the casting department made the right call. Travel down to Fiordland in the far southwest, though, and the arrangement flips entirely, with the Australian Plate diving underneath the Pacific Plate instead. So within the same small country, one plate goes under the other in the north, and the reverse happens in the south, with a transitional zone squeezed in the middle where neither plate will slide under the other. Instead, they grind sideways past each other, and that grinding has a name, the Alpine Fault, without exaggeration one of the most important geological features on Earth. The Alpine Fault runs for roughly 600 kilometres up the western edge of the South Island, a strike-slip fault, meaning the plates slide past each other horizontally while also being squeezed upward. That upward squeeze is the entire reason the Southern Alps exist. The fault ruptures in massive earthquakes roughly every 300 years, and its last major rupture was back in 1717. Do the math, and you'll notice we're comfortably overdue. New Zealand experiences somewhere around 14,000 earthquakes a year, most too small to feel, but the ground underneath this country is, quite literally, never actually still. And then there's Lake Taupo, which looks on any map like a perfectly pleasant round lake in the middle of the North Island. It is not. It's a caldera, the collapsed crater of a supervolcano, and about 26,500 years ago it produced one of the most violent eruptions in the planet's geological history, blasting out something in the region of 750 cubic miles of ash and pumice. The ground above the emptied magma chamber, collapsing to form the basin that slowly filled with water to become the lake you'd swim in today, blissfully unaware you're paddling around inside a crime scene. Taupo's most recent major eruption happened around 1,800 years ago, and by several historical accounts, it threw enough material into the atmosphere that sunsets reportedly turned strange colours as far away as Rome and China. Roman citizens staring up at a blood-red sky with no idea the cause was a lake on the other side of the planet having a bad day. Geologists reckon Taupo erupts on a rough 500-year cycle, and it's still active and monitored today, so that's fun. Moving on to calmer topics, like enormous ice fields and mountains that won't stop growing. Geographically, New Zealand splits into two very different personalities, separated by the Cook Strait, a stretch of water only about 22 kilometres wide at its narrowest, though anyone who's sailed it in rough weather will tell you it feels considerably wider. The North Island is the warmer, more geothermal sibling, home to bubbling mud pools, geysers, and that volcanic plateau. wrapped in rolling green farmland that looks deceptively peaceful for a landscape sitting on an active subduction zone. The South Island is the dramatic one, the sibling who majored in mountains. That drama is courtesy of the Southern Alps, a range stretching about 500 kilometres down the spine of the South Island, formed almost entirely by that same alpine fault shoving the crust skyward. Every one of New Zealand's peaks over 3,000 metres lives in this range, and the tallest, Aoraki, also known as Mount Cook, stands 3,724 metres high, towering over its nearest rival by more than 200 metres. And here's the unsettling part. These mountains are still rising, pushed up by tectonic pressure at a rate of several millimetres a year, while erosion wears them back down at almost the same pace. The Southern Alps are, essentially, a mountain range on a treadmill that never turns off. Keep heading south along that range, and the mountains eventually plunge straight into the ocean, creating Fjordland, a spectacular, waterlogged maze of drowned valleys across roughly 220 kilometres of coastline, carved by ancient glaciers and then flooded by the sea once the ice retreated. Milford Sound, the most famous of them, is so absurdly beautiful that Rudyard Kipling once called it the eighth wonder of the world, a bold claim from a man who presumably had access to the other seven. It's also one of the wettest inhabited places on Earth, receiving somewhere around 6 to 9 metres of rain a year, enough to make most of Britain's weather complaints look, frankly, a little precious. And then there are the glaciers, because apparently the Southern Alps weren't showing off enough already. New Zealand is home to well over 2,000 of them, the longest being the Tasman Glacier at roughly 29 kilometres. The real party trick belongs to the Fox and Franz Josef glaciers on the west coast, which descend so steeply that they reach down into temperate rainforest, meaning you can, on the right day, stand among ferns and palm trees and look straight up at a wall of ancient ice. It's the geological equivalent of finding a snowman in your greenhouse. Unfortunately, like glaciers almost everywhere, they're retreating, having lost something like 38% of their total volume since the 1960s. Which finally brings us to the part of this story that made New Zealand into an evolutionary experiment unlike anywhere else on Earth. Zealandia rifted away from Gondwana roughly 80 million years ago, before most modern mammal groups had really gotten going, and once it was adrift in open ocean, it stayed that way, isolated longer than almost any other landmass with land vertebrates on it. Whatever crossed that gap had to swim, drift or fly, and as it turns out, almost nothing that qualifies as a mammal is particularly good at any of those three. The result is a country that, for tens of millions of years, had no native land mammals whatsoever, save for 2 species of bat, which could obviously fly the distance, and simply did. One of those, the lesser short-tailed bat, is so committed to filling the mammal-shaped hole in this ecosystem that it folds up its wings and scurries around on the forest floor hunting insects, essentially cosplaying as a mouse. With no rodents, no cats, no foxes, nothing on 4 legs looking to eat anything smaller than itself, New Zealand's birds inherited the entire ground floor of the ecosystem, and they did some genuinely wild things with the opportunity. The headline act was the moa, a group of enormous flightless birds filling the ecological role usually reserved for deer or giraffes, browsing on leaves and shrubs across both islands. The largest species, the South Island giant moa, could stand roughly 3.6 metres tall with its neck stretched up, weigh over 200 kilograms, and had, remarkably, no wings at all. Not even the small vestigial stubs you'd expect. Evolution looked at the concept of flight, decided this bird would simply never need it, and cancelled the department entirely. Because moa had no mammalian predators for millions of years, they had no reason to be fast, cautious, or particularly bright, which worked out fine right up until humans arrived. Māori settlers reached New Zealand around the 13th century, one of the last major landmasses on Earth to be settled by people, and moa, having never met a two-legged predator with a spear and a plan, were spectacularly easy to hunt. Within roughly 2 centuries, every species of moa was extinct. 9 species and tens of thousands of years of evolution wiped out faster than the gap between now and the founding of the United States. And the moa didn't fall alone. Preying on the moa was Haast's eagle, the largest eagle known to have existed, with a wingspan pushing 3 meters and talons, roughly the size of a tiger's claws. Once the moa vanished, Haast's eagle had nothing left substantial enough to eat, and it went extinct not long after, one of the only known cases of an apex predator disappearing purely because its prey vanished first. So somewhere in New Zealand's past there was, briefly, a bird of prey large enough to plausibly carry off a small child, hunting a flightless creature the size of a small car. And then there wasn't. Which brings us, mercifully, to something a little less terrifying. The kiwi, New Zealand's most famous surviving bird. Kiwi are nocturnal, have whiskers like a cat, feathers that feel closer to fur than plumage, and are the only bird on Earth with nostrils at the very tip of its beak, which it uses to sniff out worms underground the way a mammal would use its nose. Naturalists half-jokingly call it New Zealand's honorary mammal. And then there's the egg. A female kiwi can lay an egg weighing up to roughly 20% of her own body weight, which, translated into human terms, is somewhere in the neighbourhood of a woman giving birth to a 6-year-old. Nature, once again, declined to be reasonable about this. And finally, since the birds had claimed every mammal-shaped job on land, something needed to fill in for the rodents, and New Zealand's insects stepped up in a way that should concern you a little. The wetapunga, a species of giant weta, holds the record for the heaviest insect ever recorded, one particularly ambitious egg-laden female, tipping the scales at around 70 grams, heavier than a sparrow. These are ancient, slow-moving, mostly harmless creatures barely changed in millions of years, essentially living fossils that grew to rodent scale simply because nothing was around to stop them. So, to summarise the entire evolutionary situation here, an isolated, sinking, 94% submerged continent spent 80 million years quietly building a world where birds hunted like eagles, foraged like mammals, and grew taller than basketball hoops, while the insects got large enough to worry about. And in Chapter 2, we're going to meet the people brave enough to sail into it. Chapter 2. The Long White Cloud. So, brave enough to sail into it. Let's sit with that for a second, because I don't think we're giving it enough credit. Somewhere out in the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific, there is a landmass roughly the size of California, sitting alone, thousands of kilometres from its nearest neighbours, and for most of human history, nobody on Earth knows it's there. No maps, no rumours, no sailor coming back to the pub with a wild story about a big foggy island full of murder birds. Just open ocean in every direction, as far as anyone's ever gone. And somewhere around 8 centuries ago, a group of people looked at that ocean and decided, yes, actually, let's go see what's out there. No satellite images, no compass. Not even a rough idea that there was anything to find. That's not exploration. That's the ancient equivalent of walking into a dark room you've never been in before, on purpose, for fun. Here's the thing, though. They weren't reckless. They were, by any reasonable standard, some of the most sophisticated navigators the world has ever produced, and they did it all without a single instrument you'd recognize. No sextant, no compass. No charts. What they had instead was a few thousand years of accumulated, hard-won expertise in reading the ocean itself, passed down voice to voice, generation to generation, until it became something closer to a sense than a skill. Navigators built a mental star compass in their heads, dividing the horizon into roughly 32 houses, each one marking where a particular star or constellation would rise or set. Get a star fix in the evening, hold that heading through the night as the sky wheels overhead, adjust as each guide star sinks below the horizon and the next one takes its shift. It's less like reading a map and more like memorizing an entire calendar of the sky and using it as a compass. And the stars were honestly the easy part, because Polynesian navigators didn't stop paying attention just because it was cloudy. They could read the ocean itself like a second set of instructions written directly onto the water. Swells behave differently depending on which island they've bounced off, refracted, or been blocked by, and a master navigator lying in the hull of a canoe could reportedly close his eyes and feel 4 or 5 different swell patterns moving through the vessel at once, then tell you if the boat had drifted off course purely from the way it rocked. Add in the flight paths of migratory birds, long-tailed cuckoos, in this particular case, obligingly making the same Pacific crossing every year, and glowing patches of bioluminescence that hint at land nearby, and you've got a full navigational toolkit built entirely out of paying extremely close attention to nature for a very, very long time. Modern sailors with satellite positioning still get lost sometimes. These guys were doing this by vibe, and the vibes were extremely accurate. Try to imagine the modern equivalent. You're driving across an entire continent at night. No GPS, no road signs, navigating purely by the smell of specific gas stations, and a deep personal familiarity with which radio static means you're near a city. That sounds absurd. And yet that's roughly the level of skill involved. Except the stakes weren't a wrong turn, they were the entire ocean, with your family and your future crammed into a wooden canoe. Which brings us to the story Māori tradition tells about how all of this actually happened here. According to that tradition, the explorer credited with discovering this land was a man named Kupe, who set out from the ancestral homeland known as Hawaii with his wife, Kupe, and the expert navigator Pekahorangi, aboard a waka called Matahorua. Depending on which version of the story you hear, Kupe was chasing a giant octopus belonging to a rival named Mutarangi, a creature that had apparently been causing chaos and stealing bait from his fishing lines back home. Say what you will about ancient grudges, but that's a genuinely fantastic reason to accidentally discover a country. He chased that octopus clean across the ocean and killed it in what's now Cook Strait. Somewhere in the origin story of an entire nation, there's a guy who was just really, really mad about his bait. But the moment that actually matters, the one still carried in the name of the country itself, happened when the crew spotted something strange on the horizon. Not land exactly, a long band of white, low and unmoving, stretched across the sky where the sea met nothing they recognized. And Kupe is said to have called out, essentially, a cloud, a long white cloud, into Reo Māori. Hiau, hiau, hiauta, Aotearoa. That band of white was cloud sitting over mountains, the telltale sign of land underneath. And that's how a country got its name, from a woman on a boat correctly identifying orographic cloud formation a very long time before anyone had a word for orographic cloud formation. Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. Not a bad name. Certainly better than whatever the octopus would have suggested. Kupe is said to have spent time exploring the coastline afterward, naming places as he went, a practice the tradition itself describes as killing the fish, a reference back to the North Island's identity as a great fish hauled up from the sea. Several place names around the top of the North Island and the northern reaches of the South Island are still attributed to that voyage. And then, according to the story, Kupe sailed home to Hawaii, leaving behind detailed sailing directions for how to find this place again, which is either an act of extraordinary generosity or the ancient equivalent of finding a great parking spot and immediately texting your friends the address. Possibly both. Now, here's where the archaeology and the oral tradition start shaking hands. Radiocarbon dating from hundreds of sites across the country points to actual, permanent human settlement beginning around the 1280s, give or take a decade or two, with the North Island settled slightly earlier and the South Island following not long after. Let that land for a second, because the number is almost funny in context. By the 1280s, the pyramids at Giza were already pushing 4,000 years old. Rome had risen, dominated half of Europe, and fallen. China had cycled through several dynasties, and this entire landmass, mountains, forests, giant eagles and all, had never once had a human being stand on it. Aotearoa is, by most estimates, the last major landmass on Earth to be settled by people. Everyone else had already had the party. New Zealand was still waiting for its invitation, and honestly, it was worth the wait. So picture it from the settlers' side. You've crossed an unmarked ocean on nothing but stars, swells and confidence, and you step out onto a cool, heavily forested land that looks almost nothing like the tropical islands you grew up on. And it's just sitting there. No people, no competition. Just forests full of birds that have never learned to be afraid of anything walking on two legs, because nothing ever has. If you were designing the easiest hunting ground on Earth, it would look a lot like this. Which is exactly what happened next, and it happened fast. This period, often called the moa hunter period, saw those enormous flightless birds we talked about in Chapter 1, hunted with brutal efficiency, and the birds simply had no defences built for it. Moa lived slow lives by bird standards, often reaching 50 years old, laying only 1 or 2 eggs a year. That's a fine strategy when your only predators are the occasional accident, but it's a catastrophic strategy against organised human hunting parties who also, for good measure, were quite happy to eat the eggs. The population had no way to recover between hunts. Recent high-precision dating suggests the extinction of the moa took as little as a century or so from the point serious hunting began, with the last individuals gone by roughly the middle of the 1400s. A bird that had thrived for millions of years, wiped from existence in less time than a really committed European royal family takes to argue about a throne. And Haast's eagle, the enormous bird of prey from Chapter 1, built specifically to hunt moa the size of a small car, didn't get a graceful exit either. Once its food source vanished, so did it, disappearing at roughly the same time as the moa. Some researchers think the eagle survives in a distorted form in Māori oral tradition, as a giant bird occasionally described as large enough to threaten people, which, if you think about it, is just an animal getting one final, extremely accurate performance review passed down as folklore. Ecosystem collapse doesn't usually move that fast. Here, it took less time than some countries spend arguing about a single highway interchange. Here's a fact that upends the tidy story people used to tell about this period. For decades, the assumption was that early settlers were purely hunters, living off moa and seals until those ran out, and only then turning to farming out of desperation. Newer evidence suggests something more impressive, that the very first settlers brought kumara, the Polynesian sweet potato, with them from the start, planting gardens as early as the 1250s in the North Island, and not much later in the south. So this wasn't a fallback plan. It was multitasking. Hunt the giant birds into oblivion with one hand, cultivate an entirely new agricultural system with the other, all within a single lifetime, in a climate that had absolutely nothing in common with the tropical Pacific these people came from. Kumara doesn't love the cold, and large parts of the South Island simply proved too cool for reliable harvests, which meant that once the moa were gone, the food-rich South became a much harder place to sustain large populations. Over the following centuries, people and power gradually drifted north toward the warmer growing regions, reshaping where and how this civilization would eventually take root. And root it did. Out of that slow adjustment, hunters becoming farmers, wanderers becoming settlers, grew the structure of classic Māori society, and it is genuinely intricate stuff. Communities organised themselves into whānau, extended families, which grouped into hapū, the real political engine of the culture, often several hundred people strong, which in turn belonged to wider iwi, the large tribal confederations tied together by shared ancestry and shared canoes. And when I say shared canoes, I mean that literally many iwi trace their lineage back to a specific migration waka, vessels like Tainui, Te Arawa, Mātātua, and Takitimu, among others, the way some families today proudly trace themselves back to a particular ship that crossed the Atlantic, except with considerably more ongoing cultural weight attached to it. Holding all of that together was Wakapapa genealogy, treated with a seriousness that makes a modern family tree look like a doodle on a napkin. Trained experts could recite thousands of interlocking ancestral names from memory, using rhythm, chant, and sometimes a carved memory stick with notches for each ancestor, purely as a recall aid. One 19th century account describes a single man reciting 1,400 names in a row for a land court hearing. 1,400. Most of us struggle to remember why we walked into the kitchen, and these people were carrying entire population registries in their heads, set to music, updated across centuries. This was also the era that gave rise to the fortified villages on hilltops and headlands, ringed with earthworks, timber palisades and storage pits, thousands of which still dot the landscape today. As hapū and iwi competed for land and status, disputes escalated into warfare, governed by the concept of utu, a social ledger of balance and reciprocity, where a wrong needed to be answered in kind to restore equilibrium. Harsh out of context, sure, but every society on Earth has some version of actions have consequences. This one just wrote it into the architecture, one palisade at a time. Alongside the pa stood the marae, the ceremonial heart of a community, and for those of high enough rank, tā moko facial and body tattoos, carved rather than inked, each design unique to its wearer, functioning like a resume written directly onto the skin. So by the time we're several centuries into this story, what you've got is not some scattered handful of castaways clinging to a strange new coastline. You've got a fully realised, richly structured civilization, tribal, agricultural, deeply oral, artistically distinctive, organised around genealogy and reciprocity and the sea that brought everyone here in the first place. Warfare and cooperation, ancestry and innovation, all humming along in relative isolation for a few more centuries yet. Isolation, of course, being the operative word, because eventually something else is going to show up on that horizon, something with a lot fewer manners than a curious explorer chasing an octopus. But that's a problem for later. For now, just picture the pa at dusk, smoke curling up from cooking fires, the tide going out over the mudflats, someone somewhere quietly practicing a genealogy chant they'll need to know perfectly by the time they're old. It's calm, it's settled, it's home, and it stayed that way for a good while longer than anyone standing on that hillside could have guessed. Chapter 3. First Contact and the Age of Muskets. That calm held for a long time, centuries of it, actually genealogies memorized, gardens planted and harvested, wars fought and settled with the neighbouring hapū, all of it happening in something close to total isolation, like the world's longest house party that nobody outside knew was happening. And then, on a December afternoon in 1642, someone standing on the shore of a place Māori called Mohua looked out at the water and saw two ships that did not belong in this story at all. The ships belonged to Abel Tasman, a Dutch explorer working for the Dutch East India Company, which is a very official way of saying he was sailing around the bottom of the world looking for places to make money. Two waka went out to investigate, blowing on trumpets called pukaya, probably as a challenge, possibly as a way of warning off whatever spirits these strange floating islands might be carrying. The Dutch, having absolutely no idea what any of that meant, blew their own trumpets back and then, for reasons that still make no sense, fired a cannon. It went about as well as you'd expect. A canoe rammed a small boat ferrying men between the two Dutch ships. 4 sailors were killed, and Tasman's men shot back. Nobody had said a single mutually intelligible word to anyone. Tasman named the place Murderer's Bay, which is a bold choice of real estate branding, and sailed off without ever once setting foot on land. He'd found something, he just had no idea what. His best guess was that this coastline was the edge of a vast, unknown southern continent, one giant landmass stretching off toward the pole, and he wrote it up that way and went home. So the first European account of New Zealand was written by a man who never got off his boat and thought he'd found something else entirely. It's the historical equivalent of writing a scathing restaurant review from the parking lot. And here's the part that's genuinely wild. Nobody came back. Not for 127 years. An entire New Zealand generation was born, grew old and died without another European ship so much as appearing on the horizon. Europe, meanwhile, was extremely busy doing what Europe does, colonizing things, fighting wars, drawing borders on other people's countries, and this one corner of the Pacific just quietly got skipped, like a group chat that forgot to add someone back after a phone upgrade. Māori life carried on, Wakapapa deepened, Pa rose and fell, and the 2 dead Dutch sailors became a strange cannon-shaped footnote nobody on this side of the world knew existed. Then, in October of 1769, Lieutenant James Cook arrived aboard a ship called the Endeavour, and this time the world showed up to stay. Cook made landfall near what's now Gisborne, at a river the local Māori called Turanganui, and things went badly almost immediately. In the first days ashore, several Māori were killed in confused, fast-moving skirmishes, including 2 men named Te Maro and Te Rakau. Cook, to his credit, was horrified by how it had gone. He named the place Poverty Bay, not for the people, but because he'd failed to get the supplies he needed there, which is a very British way of making a massacre about your grocery list. To his further credit, Cook actually learned something from it. Over his following stops around the coastline, he developed something closer to an actual policy for these encounters, trying to establish trust, trying to avoid bloodshed, showing off the power of his weapons early so nobody had to find out about them the hard way later. It didn't always work, and it wasn't kindness exactly, more like a very pragmatic form of self-preservation. Relations between Cook's crews and Māori communities over his 3 total visits swung between genuine curiosity, useful trade, deep misunderstanding, and occasional violence, sometimes within the same week. History likes clean stories. This was not one. What Cook did do, methodically and with real skill, was map the place. He sailed clean around both islands, proving once and for all that this wasn't the edge of some enormous southern continent. It was two islands, alone, in a very large ocean, with a strait running between them that now carries his name. The charts he produced were so accurate that ships were still using rough versions of them a century later, off by only a few kilometres here and there, which for a man doing it with rope, a sextant, and a lot of squinting is frankly showing off. So, somewhere around here, New Zealand stops being a rumour on a Dutch mapmaker's guess and starts being an actual place on an actual map, which, if you're a country, is basically the moment you show up in the group photo. Cook also left behind something smaller than a map, but arguably more consequential: pigs and potatoes. He handed them out on multiple visits, hoping they'd take root, and they absolutely did. Within a couple of generations, Māori communities across the country were growing potatoes at a scale their kumara gardens had never allowed, and running herds of pigs that hadn't existed here in living memory. That sounds like a nice little agricultural footnote, and for a while it was. But stockpile enough surplus pork and potatoes, and you've got yourself a genuinely valuable trade good one that, a few decades later, would turn out to be extremely convenient for buying muskets in bulk. Nobody plans these things. History just quietly loads the gun and waits. After Cook, the visitors kept coming, and the profile dropped considerably. Sealers, whalers and timber traders started showing up through the 1790s and into the 1800s, mostly out of Sydney, mostly after seal skins, whale oil, and the enormous straight-grained kauri trees that made unbeatable ship masts. This was not a polished operation. This was escaped convicts, deserters, and rough men on rough ships settling in around the Bay of Islands. And the town that grew up to service them, a place called Kororareka, earned itself the nickname the hellhole of the Pacific. By the 1830s, it had more grog shops than general stores and, depending which sailor you asked, considerably more brothels than churches. Imagine the roughest port town you can picture. Then remember there was no police force within about 2,000 kilometres. It was not all rowdy fun either. In December of 1809, a ship called the Boyd anchored at Wangaroa harbour to load timber, and its crew had, on an earlier voyage, whipped a young rangatira named Te Ara for refusing work he considered beneath him. That was a catastrophic insult to make, and local Māori did not forget it. When the Boyd arrived again, they killed, and by most accounts, ate somewhere between 60 and 70 of the crew and passengers, still the deadliest single encounter between Māori and Europeans in the country's history. European whalers retaliated against the wrong village entirely, killing more people who'd had nothing to do with it. Shipping visits to New Zealand nearly stopped for years afterward. Trust, once broken that badly, does not repair itself quickly. Into this rough, half-lawless world walked Samuel Marsden, an Anglican missionary who'd been trying to get here since before the Boyd disaster scared everyone off. He finally landed at the Bay of Islands in 1814, preached the country's first Christian sermon on Christmas Day, and spent years afterward trying to bring in agriculture, literacy, and, pointedly, an end to two specific local trades he found appalling: the sale of muskets to Māori and the sale of preserved, tattooed human heads to European collectors. He failed at both, comprehensively. Which brings us, unfortunately, to the muskets themselves, and to the part of this story that stops being a rowdy frontier tale and becomes something considerably heavier. Muskets had actually reached New Zealand a little earlier, and the first real lesson in how to use them went badly for the side that had them. In a battle at Moromonui around 1807, a Ngāpuhi war party, armed with some of the first muskets in the country, was ambushed and beaten by Ngāti Whātua fighters carrying nothing but traditional weapons because reloading a musket by hand takes time, and a warrior with a club does not politely wait for you to finish. One of the Ngāpuhi survivors of that humiliating defeat was a young chief named Hongi Hika. He absorbed the lesson completely. The problem wasn't the muskets. The problem was not having enough of them. Hongi spent the next decade fixing that. In 1820, he travelled all the way to England with a missionary named Thomas Kendall to help compile a Maori dictionary at Cambridge. And while there, he was received by King George IV himself, who was apparently charmed enough by this tattooed, dignified foreign chief to hand him a trunk full of gifts, including a full suit of armour. On the way home, passing back through Sydney, Hongi traded almost everything in that trunk for roughly 300 muskets. He kept the armour. Everything else became firepower. It is genuinely one of history's great "be careful what you're generous with" stories, a king's gift converted, line item by line item, into the largest private arsenal the Pacific had ever seen. What Hongi did with those muskets over the following years is where this story stops being darkly funny and just becomes dark. Picture a village in the Bay of Plenty in 1818, or one in the Waikato a couple of years later, people going about ordinary life, harvesting kumara, minding children, entirely unaware that an army armed with weapons they'd never seen was approaching from the north. There was no ritual challenge this time, no negotiated terms of engagement the way traditional Utu-driven conflict often worked. There was overwhelming firepower against people holding wood and stone, and the result wasn't a battle so much as a slaughter. Entire communities were killed, captured, or scattered in a single morning. That happened again and again across the North Island for the better part of 2 decades. And here's the truly grim mechanics of it. This didn't stay contained because it couldn't. Every iwi that got hit by Ngāpuhi's muskets had exactly one rational response, which was to get muskets of their own as fast as possible by whatever means necessary. So the trade networks exploded. Flax, pigs, potatoes, land access, anything that could be swapped in Sydney for firearms got swapped. Some communities began preserving the tattooed heads of slain enemies and slaves specifically as trade currency, because a well-preserved head could fetch you actual weapons. Within a generation, iwi from Northland to the Waikato to the East Coast were all armed, all anxious, and all locked into a spiral where laying down your weapons first was the one thing nobody could afford to try. The scale of what these musket wars did to the country across roughly the 1810s through the 1830s is genuinely staggering. Historians estimate tens of thousands of Maori killed, entire regions depopulated or emptied out as survivors fled inland or to safer coastlines, whole iwi displaced from lands their ancestors had held for generations, waka papa lines that had held steady since the Great Migration waka were broken in a single afternoon of gunfire. This wasn't a footnote. For the better part of 2 decades, this was the defining fact of life across huge stretches of the North Island, and it reshaped the tribal map of the country in ways still felt today. It burned itself out eventually, the way these things do once the imbalance that started it stops existing. By the 1830s, muskets had spread widely enough that nobody held a decisive advantage anymore, which meant the old brutal math of arm up or die started giving way to sheer exhaustion. Some fighting dragged on into the 1840s, but the worst of it was behind the country by then, leaving communities everywhere trying to rebuild, missionaries trying to broker peace between old enemies, and the pressure on Māori and on the handful of British officials watching nervously from the sidelines, building towards something that would have to change how this country was governed altogether. Because by the late 1830s, everyone involved could see it. Māori leaders exhausted by decades of warfare, worried about lawless Pākehā settlements and land-hungry newcomers arriving with no rules at all. British officials increasingly nervous about a colony they didn't officially control, but were quietly worried someone else, the French, mainly, might grab first. Missionaries writing home about a frontier spiralling further out of anyone's hands. All of it was building toward a decision, on a lawn at the Bay of Islands, that would try to answer an impossible question. How do you draw a line between two peoples who just spent 30 years learning, the hard way, exactly what happens when there isn't one? Chapter 4. One People, Several Interpretations. Picture the lawn, late January 1840, Bay of Islands, and a British naval captain named William Hobson has just stepped off a ship with a headache and a job he does not have nearly enough paperwork to do. He is here to get Maori chiefs to sign away sovereignty of a country the size of Britain in roughly 2 weeks, using a document he has not written yet, translated into a language he does not speak, by people he is meeting for the first time. If that sounds like a recipe for a clean, uncomplicated outcome, you have not been paying attention for the last 3 chapters. Hobson had his secretary draft some notes. The resident, James Busby, tidied them up into something resembling a treaty. And then, on the evening of February the 4th, with the signing scheduled for 2 days later, the whole thing got handed to the missionary Henry Williams and his son Edward to translate into Maori overnight. One evening, a pot of tea presumably, and the fate of a nation. They were not being lazy, there simply was no time, but you should sit with that detail for a second, because everything that follows, every grievance, every war, every apology delivered by a government 150 years later traces back in some part to a rush job finished before breakfast. Here is the problem, and it is not a small one. The English draft had Maori ceding sovereignty total, absolute, no-take-backsies authority over the country. The Maori translation used a word the missionaries had basically invented for the occasion, kawanatanga, which meant something closer to governorship, administration, the right to run a post office and appoint a governor, not the right to own everyone's land and tell them what to do with it. In exchange, the Maori text promised chiefs would keep Tino Rangatiratanga their full, unqualified chieftainship over their lands, their villages, and all their treasured things. 2 documents. 1 signing ceremony. Wildly different contracts, and nobody in the room was lying exactly. They were just reading 2 different books with the same cover. On February the 6th, more than 40 chiefs stepped up and signed the Maori version, the only version most of them ever saw. Hobson shook each hand and said the same line every time he iwitahi tatu. We are now one people, which is either genuinely moving or a little rich, depending entirely on which text you just read. Over the next 7 months, officials hauled the document around the country to roughly 50 more gatherings, collecting another 500 signatures from chiefs who, in most cases, were being asked to trust a translation of a translation, explained by men with an obvious interest in a yes. Not everyone said yes. Tuho didn't sign. Neither did Te Arawa or Ngati Tuharetua, tribes with their own reasons for staying out of a deal being brokered by outsiders. And in the Waikato, a senior chief named Te Werohero was asked, and asked again, and declined every time. Keep that name in your pocket. He is going to come up again shortly, and not because he changed his mind. Step back and look at what actually happened here, because it deserves more than a shrug. The Crown walked away from Waitangi believing it had acquired a country. Most of the chiefs who signed walked away believing they had acquired a protector, a governor to police the increasingly chaotic settler frontier you heard about last chapter, while everything that actually mattered, the land, the authority, the way of life, stayed exactly where it had always been, in their hands. Both sides were sincere. Both sides were wrong about what the other one thought they'd agreed to. And when two people shake hands on fundamentally different deals, someone always ends up feeling robbed. It just usually takes a few years for the bill to arrive. It did not take long. Word of a stable, treaty-protected colony reached London, and London had a man ready for exactly this moment, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, a theorist who believed you could build a tidy, class-ordered slice of England on the other side of the planet if you just sold the land at the right price before anyone bothered to properly buy it from the people living on it. His outfit, the New Zealand Company, started selling sections of New Zealand to eager settlers in London parlour rooms months before anyone had secured clear title to most of it. It is roughly the 19th century equivalent of pre-selling apartments in a building that hasn't gotten planning permission on land you don't currently own, to buyers who have never seen the site. Remarkably, this went about as well as you'd expect. Even so, the settlements came fast. Wellington in 1840, Nelson the year after. New Plymouth, courtesy of a spin-off called the Plymouth Company, arriving around the same time. Then two more deliberate, almost theme park versions of Britain Otago in 1848, founded by Scottish Free Church settlers who wanted a pious Presbyterian paradise, and Canterbury in 1850, an Anglican fantasy complete with a cathedral city planned before a single building existed. Wakefield wanted an orderly, hierarchical little society. What he mostly got was thousands of new arrivals landing on a coastline where the actual, on-the-ground question of who owned what land had never been properly settled in the first place. And that is where the arithmetic turns ugly. In 1840, there were a few thousand settlers scattered across New Zealand. Within 20 years, there were tens of thousands, all of them wanting land, most of them not especially interested in the fine print of Kawanatanga versus Tino Rangatiratanga. Purchases that had once been small, negotiated, and at least nominally consensual started sliding into something closer to pressure and outright seizure. Chiefs who thought they'd kept their authority found settlers, surveyors, and government agents treating land as though it were already theirs. You do not need a history degree to guess what happens next. You just need to have seen literally any other colonial frontier in this era. The North went first. An Ngapui chief named Hone Heke had backed the treaty enthusiastically in 1840, largely because he expected trade and status to follow. Instead, the capital moved south to Auckland. Customs revenue dried up, and Heke watched his region's fortunes decline, while the flagstaff over Kororeka, a British flag, planted on a hill above the very town his people had built their prosperity on, became the most convenient symbol of the whole broken bargain. So he chopped it down. Then the government put it back up, and he chopped it down again. 4 times, across 1844 and 45, in what has to be one of history's most persistent acts of civil disobedience against a piece of wood. Nobody was laughing by March of 1845, when Heke and his ally Kawiti led several hundred fighters into Kororeka itself, torched the town, and finally dropped that flagstaff for good. The Northern War ground on for another year, ending in a rough stalemate after the fortified PA at Ruapekapeka fell in early 1846, a war that, in the end, changed the map very little but changed the mood of the entire colony permanently. The old frontier chaos of the last chapter was giving way to something new, organised, formal, uniformed conflict with the machinery of empire behind it. Meanwhile, in the Waikato, Maori leaders had been watching land slip away tribe by tribe and decided that the old system, dozens of independent chiefs, each negotiating alone, simply wasn't holding the line. So in 1858, several tribes united behind a single figurehead to refuse to sell any more land collectively. Their chosen king was Te Wairohero, crowned as Potatau I. Yes, that Te Wairohero, the same man who had looked colonial officials in the eye back in 1840 and quietly declined to sign. He spent his whole life saying no to the same encroachment, just with slightly better titles each time. The Kīngitanga, as the movement became known, terrified the colonial government far more than any single battle could, because it was not a rebellion so much as an alternative government, a functioning, land-holding, tax-collecting Maori polity sitting in the middle of the North Island's richest farmland. In July of 1863, Governor George Grey decided he'd had enough of the alternative. He demanded an oath of allegiance from Maori north of the Mangatawiri River, then marched troops across it 2 days later. The Kīngitanga read this, correctly, as a declaration of war. Grey read the Kīngitanga's continued existence as an act of rebellion. Neither side was under any illusions about what came next. What came next was frankly absurd in scale. 12,000 imperial troops, backed by artillery and steamers, against fewer than 5,000 part-time Maori fighters who mostly still had to go home occasionally to plant crops. It is the sort of mismatch that should have ended in a week. Instead, it dragged on for the better part of a year, partly because the Kīngitanga forces built ingenious fortified pa and simply refused to fight fair, and partly because of men like Riwi Maniapoto, who led the defence of the PA at Orokau in April of 1864. Surrounded, starving, offered the chance to surrender with their women and children spared, his people gave an answer that has echoed through New Zealand history. Ever since we will fight on, forever and ever and ever. They broke out through the British lines instead. Not everyone made it, but nobody broke. And then came the bill. The New Zealand Settlements Act of 1863 let the government confiscate land from anyone deemed to be in rebellion, which in practice meant enormous, sweeping raupatu, roughly 1.2 million acres seized from Waikato tribes alone, with more taken across Taranaki and the Bay of Plenty in the years that followed. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. Some of that land was taken from iwi who had never actually fired a shot. Guilt by geography, guilt by relation, guilt by simply owning land the colony wanted. It is one thing to lose a war, it is another thing entirely to lose your home, for a war you weren't in. That wound did not heal quietly, and honestly, it still hasn't fully healed today. Down in Taranaki, a chief named Tito Kowaru picked up that same fight in 1868, after settlers pushed onto confiscated land near his people's territory. For the better part of a year he ran a campaign so effective he never lost a single battle, routing colonial forces at Tungutu o Te Manu with what contemporaries described as genuinely brilliant tactics. And then, at the peak of his success, with victory arguably within reach, his forces simply melted away. Historians still debate exactly why, though a scandal involving another chief's wife gets mentioned more often than you'd expect for a 19th century military campaign. Tito Kowaru himself slipped away into the swamps in March of 1869 and was never captured. An undefeated general who somehow still lost the war. New Zealand history does that a lot. While all of that was unfolding, an entirely different kind of chaos hit the South Island, and this one arrived with a shovel instead of a musket. In May of 1861, a prospector named Gabriel Reed found gold in a gully in Otago, and within 6 months the province's population more than doubled, swelling from under 13,000 people to over 30,000. a good chunk of them arriving straight off boats from the Australian goldfields. Then, in the mid-1860s, an even bigger rush hit the west coast, and at its peak in 1867, roughly 29,000 people were crammed onto that narrow strip of coastline, meaning, at that exact moment, something like 1 in every 5 European men in the entire colony was down there, panning a river, which is either a remarkable act of national ambition or the largest simultaneous midlife crisis in New Zealand's history. Possibly both. By the early 1870s, the shape of the country had changed almost beyond recognition from where we started this chapter. Gold had made the South Island rich and crowded, tilting the colony's population and wealth south for the first time. Settler numbers had climbed into the hundreds of thousands. And across the North Island, iwi, who had once held every hectare of the land, now watched government surveyors carve up confiscated blocks for farms that would never belong to them again. The Crown had its country. It just didn't have it the way it had promised on that lawn back in February of 1840. New Zealand was, by any practical measure, a settler colony now organised, prosperous, expanding fast. But underneath the new roads and the new towns sat a grievance that a signature and a mistranslation had planted 30 years earlier, and it was not going anywhere. Not for 100 years, maybe not ever, fully. Which is a strange, heavy thing to build a nation on top of, and yet somehow, remarkably, that is exactly what New Zealand was about to do next. Chapter 5. The Social Laboratory Goes to War. And build it did. By the 1890s, New Zealand had stopped thinking of itself as a scrappy little outpost clinging to the edge of the map and started thinking of itself as something more interesting. A test case. A place where a government could try out ideas too radical for London and see if the country survived. They called it the Social Laboratory. Sometimes the working man's paradise, and for once the marketing wasn't total nonsense. Minimum wage laws. Compulsory arbitration between employers and unions, instead of strikes turning into street brawls. A government that genuinely seemed to believe ordinary people deserved a decent life, not just the people who already owned the land. It was, by the standards of the 1890s, borderline utopian, which, as always, meant the rest of the world was watching closely, mostly to see if it would blow up. It didn't blow up. In fact, it got weirder and better, and it started with the women. In 1893, a Christchurch woman named Kate Sheppard finished off a campaign she and the Women's Christian Temperance Union had been running for years. And the result was one of the strangest and most magnificent documents in the country's history. They called it the Monster Petition, and monster is generous. Sheppard's team gathered nearly 32,000 signatures from women across the colony, glued the sheets end to end, and wound the whole thing around a broom handle because nobody had invented a better storage solution for a petition longer than 2 rugby fields. When it was finally unrolled across the floor of Parliament, it stretched close to 270 metres. Imagine being the poor clerk who had to catalogue that. Premier Richard Seddon, a large and stubborn man who did not love being told what to do, fought it anyway. He lost. On the 19th of September, 1893, the Electoral Act passed, and New Zealand became the first country on earth to give women the vote in parliamentary elections. Not the first to promise it, not the first to argue about it in a committee for 30 years, the first to actually do it. Suffragists in Britain and the United States would spend another generation fighting for the same thing, and more than a few of them pointed across the world at this small, damp, sheep-covered country and said, essentially, well, they managed it. That tends to happen when you let people show up. Sheppard herself would eventually end up on the country's $10 note, which is a strange kind of immortality, outliving your own century by getting laminated and handed around in pubs. The country wasn't done showing off. In 1898 it passed the Old Age Pensions Act, the first scheme anywhere funded out of general taxation rather than some workers' own forced savings. It came with a catch that says everything about the era you had to prove you were, and this is the actual legal language of good moral character, which in practice meant a lot of very tired 65-year-olds having to convince a government official they hadn't been too much fun in their youth. Bureaucratic absurdity aside, the idea worked, and it worked well enough that a New Zealand civil servant went to London and helped talk the British government into copying it a decade later. Then in 1907, almost as a formality, the colony upgraded itself to Dominion status, self-governing in every way that mattered, still politely nodding at the Crown. It was less a revolution than a title change on the letterhead. Nobody's daily life changed overnight. No parades broke out. The sheep did not seem especially moved. But letterheads matter, and this one said, unmistakably, we're not children anymore. It would take the rest of the century to prove that claim in the places that actually count, but for now, on paper at least, New Zealand had officially graduated. Which was an unfortunate thing to prove right before the 20th century decided to test it. When Britain declared war on Germany in August of 1914, New Zealand didn't hesitate, didn't debate, didn't really consider any option except in... This was a country of just over 1 million people, fewer people than live in a mid-sized city today, and it would go on to send more than 100,000 men and women overseas to fight. Try to sit with that ratio for a second. It's not a nation sending an army, it's closer to a nation sending itself. Farmers, school teachers, bank clerks, teenage boys who'd lied about their age to a recruiting officer who was, by all accounts, not exactly rigorous about checking all of them boarding ships bound for a war on the other side of the planet, for an empire most of them had never actually seen. The landing came first, and it came at Gallipoli, on the 25th of April, 1915. New Zealand troops waded ashore at a small cove on the Turkish peninsula that nobody back home had heard of, and everybody would remember forever. By the end of that first day, more than 100 of them were already dead. The campaign dragged on for 8 brutal months of heat, disease, and men dying to take ground measured in meters, and by the time it ended, nearly 2,800 New Zealanders had been killed there, close to 1/6 of everyone who'd landed. Out of that horror came a word that didn't exist before the war and hasn't left the country's vocabulary since. ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. A shared grief that somehow, deliberately, turned itself into a shared identity, and a date ANZAC Day that New Zealanders still stand in the cold dark before dawn to observe, more than a century later. Here's the part the postcards tend to leave out. Gallipoli is the story New Zealand tells about itself, but it's not actually where most of the dying happened. That was the Western Front, France and Belgium, mud and artillery and years of grinding, industrial slaughter that make Gallipoli look almost intimate by comparison. And within that story there is one single morning that stands apart from everything else. On the 12th of October, 1917, in an attack near the village of Passchendaele, 843 New Zealand soldiers were killed before lunchtime. One morning. It remains, to this day, the deadliest day in the country's entire military history, worse than anything before or since. There is no joke to make about that. There isn't supposed to be. By the time the guns finally went quiet in 1918, around 18,500 New Zealanders were dead, and tens of thousands more had been wounded, disfigured, gassed, or broken in ways that didn't show on the outside. More than half of everyone who served became a casualty of some kind. Only Serbia lost a higher share of its population in the entire war. Think about what that meant for a country this size. Nearly every town, every family, every rugby club and church congregation had someone who didn't come home, or came home and was never quite the same again, sitting quietly at the edge of family gatherings for the next 40 years, never talking about any of it. New Zealand had spent 30 years building a reputation as the place that did things first and did them well. Now, it had also become one of the places that had bled the most to prove it belonged on the world stage at all. There wasn't much time to recover before the ground shifted again, and this time it wasn't a war that did it, it was the economy. The Great Depression hit New Zealand hard, and it hit fast. Registered unemployment more than doubled in a single year, climbing from around 21,000 in early 1931 towards 70,000 by the following winter, in a country that, remember, still only had about 1.5 million people total. Married men were shipped off to relief camps, doing hard labour in remote, primitive conditions for wages that barely qualified as wages. It was dignity, technically, in the sense that you were working rather than begging. Everyone involved knew it was really just begging with a shovel. Eventually, people stopped accepting that quietly. In January of 1932, a crowd of unemployed workers in Dunedin marched on the local relief board, got refused, and smashed the windows of the nearest grocery store out of sheer furious desperation. That was a preview. The real explosion came in April in Auckland, when a police officer struck down an unemployed workers' leader named Jim Edwards in front of a crowd that had gathered outside the town hall. The crowd did not take that well. What followed was a night of rampaging down Queen Street, fence palings and stones through shop windows, looting that ran from jewellery to liquor to whatever else was within arm's reach. And by the end of it, more than 200 people were injured, and roughly 250 windows lay in glittering ruin across the pavement, glass crunching underfoot the length of the street while shopkeepers watched their livelihoods disappear into pillowcases. The workingman's paradise was having a rough decade. It got worse before it got better, because in 1939 the world went back to war, and New Zealand, true to form, went with it. The 2nd New Zealand Division became the country's main fighting force overseas, and it earned a reputation as some of the most capable infantry in the entire Allied effort, which is a nice way of saying they kept getting sent to the worst places available. Greece in 1941, Crete right after, a defeat so grim that survivors talked about it for the rest of their lives. Then years grinding through the North African desert Operation Crusader, El Alamein, back and forth across sand that changed hands so many times the maps could barely keep up before moving on to Italy for the brutal mountainous slog through places like Monte Cassino. Roughly 105,000 New Zealanders served overseas in this war. Close to 12,000 of them never came home. And then, in February of 1942, came the moment that changed how New Zealand saw its place in the world forever. For decades, the country's entire defence strategy had rested on a single comforting assumption that if trouble ever came from Asia, the mighty British fleet would sail to the great naval base at Singapore and handle it. New Zealand had even helped pay for that base, pouring money into its construction for years until it was finally finished in 1938. Then Singapore fell to the Japanese in a matter of days, and the whole assumption collapsed with it. Britain, it turned out, could not actually protect New Zealand, not from this. The realization landed like a physical blow, because in a very real sense, it was won. Air raid shelters started appearing in Auckland backyards. Coastal defences went up along beaches that had never seen so much as a rowboat full of trouble. For the first time in its history, New Zealand had to seriously consider the possibility of being invaded, not in some abstract imperial sense, but literally on its own soil. With its own best troops still fighting someone else's war on the far side of the globe, New Zealand didn't waste much time sulking about it. Prime Minister Peter Fraser sent a minister directly to Washington to build a relationship with the United States that hadn't existed before, and drew closer to Australia's government than ever, planting the earliest seeds of what would eventually grow into a formal Pacific alliance. In the meantime, thousands of American troops arrived to be stationed in New Zealand ahead of the Pacific campaigns, and the culture clash that followed was its own small chapter of history. Homesick Kiwi soldiers overseas, and back home, well-paid, well-dressed American servicemen suddenly very popular at the local dances. New Zealand men fighting in Italy heard about it, and were, by most accounts, thrilled beyond words. Truly a banner era for domestic tranquility. When the war finally ended, the numbers told their own story. New Zealand's death rate per million people ended up the highest anywhere in the Commonwealth, worse than Britain's, worse than Australia's, a small country once again paying an outsized price to stand with everyone else. Between the trenches of the First World War and the deserts and mountains of the Second, this country of barely more than 1 million people at the start of it all had now buried close to 30,000 of its own across 2 global catastrophes, alongside a depression that had humiliated it in between. And yet look at what was left standing, a nation that had given women the vote before anyone else on earth, a nation that had built the first tax-funded pension, a nation that had fought at Gallipoli and the Western Front and the deserts of Africa and the mountains of Italy, and had learned the hard way that the old motherland could not always be relied upon. New Zealand was no longer a colony playing dress-up as a country. It had grown up, fast and painfully, through 2 wars and a depression, and it was about to step into the post-war world, asking a very different question than it had ever asked before. Not what does Britain need from us, but what do we actually want to become? Chapter 6. Small, loud, and finally its own. So, that was the question hanging in the air. What do we actually want to become? For a while, New Zealand's answer was, honestly, whatever we already are, just more comfortable. Wool prices boomed during the Korean War, and New Zealand farmers became, briefly, some of the wealthiest people per capita on the planet. A genuinely strange sentence to write about a country whose main export was sheep hair. Britain kept buying everything New Zealand could produce: butter, cheese, lamb, more butter, and New Zealand kept producing it, comfortable in an arrangement that had worked for the better part of a century. It felt permanent. It was, as it turned out, neither. Because in 1973, Britain joined the European Economic Community. On paper, this was a story about tariffs and treaties and men in grey suits arguing in Brussels. In practice, it was New Zealand losing its best customer overnight, the economic equivalent of your only employer merging with a rival firm and quietly forgetting your name. At the time, close to half of everything New Zealand exported went to Britain, roughly 90% of its butter, 3/4 of its cheese. Within a few years, those quotas were slashed by staggering margins, and New Zealand was left holding an economy built almost entirely around a relationship that had just, politely, moved on. New Zealanders have a word for it now, half joke and half grievance Brentry. So New Zealand did what small countries with no other option tend to do. It went looking for new friends, fast trade missions to Japan, the United States, eventually China. The pivot worked, more or less, but by the early 1980s the economy was still in rough shape. Inflation climbing, unemployment climbing, a government trying to freeze wages and prices in place like a man attempting to stop a river by yelling at it. It did not work. Rivers, as a rule, do not respond well to being yelled at. Something had to give, and in 1984 it finally did, all at once on live television. The 1984 election brought in a Labour government under a large, quick-witted lawyer named David Lang, and everyone assumed they knew what they were getting, a party of workers and unions, doing traditional Labour things. Instead, they got Roger Douglas, the new finance minister, who looked at New Zealand's tightly controlled economy and decided to deregulate almost all of it almost immediately. The dollar was floated. Subsidies vanished. Tariffs came down. Government departments that had existed since practically the Dominion days were broken apart, sold off or switched off. They called it Rogernomics, one of the most radical peacetime economic transformations any democracy has put itself through voluntarily. Inflation eventually came down. So did a lot of people sense that the government was on their side, and unemployment rose sharply enough that the cost of all that efficiency is still argued about today, usually at dinner parties. Lang's government wasn't just rewriting the economy, though. It was rewriting who New Zealand took orders from, nowhere more clearly than on nuclear weapons. New Zealand had spent decades as a loyal, uncomplaining member of ANZAC, the defence pact binding it to Australia and the United States, the kind of ally that shows up, says yes, and doesn't ask too many questions. In 1984 that changed. Labour campaigned on making New Zealand nuclear-free, and actually meant it. In February of 1985, New Zealand refused a routine port visit from an American warship because Washington wouldn't confirm or deny whether it carried nuclear weapons, and New Zealand's answer, essentially, was fine, then it's not welcome. It sounds like a small bureaucratic squabble. It was not. It was a country of 3 million people telling the most powerful military on earth no. Washington did not love this. American officials made it clear that turning away nuclear ships meant turning away the alliance, and New Zealand, somewhat astonishingly, let the security guarantee lapse rather than back down. David Lang became an unlikely international celebrity out of the affair, most famously in March of 1985, when he flew to Oxford to debate an American televangelist on whether nuclear weapons are morally indefensible, and delivered one of the more quotable lines in the history of student debating. Informing his opponent, he could smell the uranium on his breath as the man approached the microphone. It was blunt, it was funny, and it was broadcast around the world, turning a squabble about warship visits into the moment a small Pacific nation discovered it had a moral megaphone considerably larger than its population. Then, a few months later, someone tried to blow that megaphone up. In July of 1985, the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior was docked in Auckland Harbour, preparing to lead a protest flotilla against French nuclear testing in the Pacific. In the middle of the night, 2 bombs planted below its waterline tore the hull open, sinking the ship and killing a photographer named Fernando Pereira, who drowned trying to grab his cameras on the way out. Police arrested 2 French agents hiding under fake Swiss identities, and the trail led almost unbelievably straight back to the French government's own secret service, which had sent a bombing team into a friendly, unarmed democracy to sink a boat. France's own Prime Minister eventually admitted it publicly, on television. It remains the only act of state-sponsored terrorism ever carried out on New Zealand soil, and it did not make the country less committed to its nuclear-free stance. If anything, it convinced everyone they'd been right all along. By 1987, New Zealand made it permanent and legally binding, passing the Nuclear-Free Zone, Disarmament and Arms Control Act, banning nuclear weapons and nuclear-powered vessels from its waters entirely, no exceptions, no matter how politely Washington asked. ANZAC, in any meaningful sense, was over. New Zealand had traded a security guarantee from its most powerful ally for a principle, which is not usually how small nations play this game. And plenty of analysts assumed the country would come to regret it. It didn't. Decades later, the law is still in place, still popular, treated less like legislation than a personality trait. Ask most New Zealanders why, and they'll shrug and say, well, why would we want them here? While all of that was happening on the world stage, a quieter and more consequential shift was underway back home. In 1975, the government established the Waitangi Tribunal, a body created to investigate Maori grievances about broken promises under the treaty signed back in 1840, a document treated for more than a century as a historical relic rather than an enforceable agreement. At first, the tribunal could only look at complaints from 1975 onward, a bit like opening a complaints department and telling everyone they can only complain about things that happened after it opened. Someone eventually noticed the problem, and in the mid-1980s its authority was extended back to 1840 itself. Suddenly, a century and a half of land confiscations and quiet institutional theft was, for the first time, up for formal review. What followed was decades of negotiation, apology, and eventually money, real money, paid out as formal treaty settlements to iwi across the country. Waikato Tainui settled first, in 1995, receiving a package worth around $170 million along with a formal Crown apology for the land confiscations of the 1860s. Ngai Tahu, the dominant iwi across most of the South Island, settled soon after with a similarly landmark deal. More followed, iwi by iwi, each with its own apology and negotiated redress small ceremonies that could never undo what happened, but at least, finally, said out loud that it had. It has been slow, occasionally bitter work, still not entirely finished, but it represents something New Zealand spent its first century avoiding, actually reckoning with its own founding document. Alongside the money and the apologies came something harder to legislate a language, coming back from the edge. By the early 1980s, fewer than 1 in 5 Maori could speak Te Reo fluently, and elders watching that decline decided it had to be caught at the very beginning of a life, or not caught at all. Starting in 1982, communities began opening kohanga reo, language nests, immersing babies and toddlers in Maori from infancy, on the theory that you save a language in the cot, not the classroom. Within a few years there were hundreds of them, thousands of children growing up thinking in a language their own parents had sometimes been punished for speaking at school a generation earlier. In 1987, Te Reo Maori became an official language of New Zealand by law, a language that had genuinely been dying, getting, against fairly long odds, a second life. That cultural resurgence didn't stay confined to classrooms and courtrooms. It ended up, of all places, on the rugby field. New Zealand's national team had been performing a haka before matches since the late 1880s, usually the ka mate haka, composed around 1820 by a Ngāti Toa chief named Te Rauparaha to celebrate surviving an ambush by hiding down a hole in the ground. A slightly less glamorous origin story than most national symbols get. By the modern era, it had become a genuine, goosebump-inducing statement of identity, occasionally answered by opposing teams standing their ground in response. A country that once tried to stamp Maori language out of its schools now sends it onto the world's biggest sporting stages, chest first. Modern New Zealand has also had to prove it can absorb a genuine gut punch and keep functioning. In September of 2010, a powerful earthquake struck near Christchurch, and remarkably, nobody died. Then, in February of 2011, a smaller but far shallower quake hit directly under the city at lunchtime on an ordinary Tuesday, and the ground simply gave way beneath entire streets. 185 people were killed. Thousands of homes were damaged beyond saving. Whole suburbs turned unlivable by liquefaction, the soil itself briefly turning to something closer to soup. What followed was not glamorous. It was neighbours checking on neighbours, volunteers with shovels clearing silt out of strangers' driveways for weeks on end. Christchurch is still, in places, visibly a city that survived something. It just also, stubbornly, kept going. On a considerably lighter note, New Zealand also somehow became the physical location of Middle-earth. When Peter Jackson filmed the Lord of the Rings trilogy across the country's mountains and valleys starting in the late 1990s, he did more for tourism than several decades of government campaigns combined. Visitor numbers climbed sharply in the years that followed, and by the late 2010s, something like 1 in 5 holidaymakers admitted the films were part of why they'd come. Immigration officials started stamping passports with a small welcome to Middle-earth. New Zealand got a permanent, gorgeous, free advertisement for its scenery, and millions of people got to go stand in a genuinely stunning landscape and pretend, just for a photo, that a hobbit might live there. So, here it is then. The question that closed the last chapter, finally, quietly, answered not with a declaration but with decades of ordinary, occasionally messy living. What did New Zealand want to become? It became a country willing to tell its most powerful ally no, and mean it. A country slowly, imperfectly, learning to say sorry to the people it had wronged, and mean that too. A country where a language nearly lost within living memory is now sung by 80,000 people in a stadium before a rugby match, without anyone finding it strange anymore. It is worth pausing here, at the very end, to look back and see just how far the story stretches. Go back to the very beginning, if you can still picture it. A sliver of land, mostly underwater, drifting alone for 80 million years. Just birds evolving into things that forgot how to fly because nothing was chasing them. Then, astonishingly late in human history, a handful of the greatest navigators the world has ever produced found it anyway, guided by stars and swells and sheer, staggering nerve, and decided this impossibly remote, impossibly beautiful place was worth staying. Then came muskets and missionaries and a treaty signed in good faith and broken in bad, and wars nobody living had chosen, and a depression and beaches braced for an invasion that never came, and a language nearly lost, and a harbour bombed by a friendly government, and a city's streets breaking open at lunchtime on an ordinary Tuesday. All of it, somehow, arriving here small, stubborn, increasingly bicultural, and entirely, finally, itself. There is something quietly reassuring in that, if you let it sit with you for a moment. A place that spent so long being defined by other people, by Britain's needs, Britain's markets, Britain's wars eventually just decided to stop waiting for permission and figure out its own answer instead. It took a long time, and it wasn't especially tidy, and honestly, most good answers to that kind of question never are. So if you take nothing else from this journey, take this. Somewhere on the other side of the world tonight, the Southern Cross is hanging over 2 long, quiet islands that spent millions of years underwater, waiting patiently for someone to finally arrive and call them home. They're still there. They're not going anywhere. And neither, for tonight, do you have to. Sleep well.